One of the profound consequences of World War I was the Russian Revolution, which brought communism to power in Russia. The revolutions of 1917 transformed Russia into a dictatorship that would last over 70 years and set the stage for the Cold War, the dominant geopolitical struggle of the late 20th century. Before diving into 1917, we need to understand why Russia was ripe for revolution. For most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, Russia stood apart from the great developments that shaped Western Europe. Russia did not experience the major transformations that reshaped much of Europe during the 19th century. Industrialization remained limited. Liberal reforms were largely absent, and the country saw few meaningful constitutional or democratic advancements. Russia also participated only marginally in the intellectual movements that influenced Western Europe. Its involvement in broader European affairs generally occurred only when circumstances forced it, such as during Napoleon's invasion or World War I. As a result, Russia remained predominantly a feudal, agricultural society governed by a deeply entrenched autocratic system. The history of Russia was, in many ways, the history of its Tsars. Even in the early 20th century, the country retained many traditional features that had disappeared elsewhere in Europe, including a rigid social hierarchy, a powerful noble class, a largely illiterate peasantry, and an absolute monarchy. Despite growing pressures for modernization, the Tsar remained the central figure in Russian society and politics. Most Russians viewed the Tsar with deep reverence, referring to him affectionately as their little father. In many homes, portraits of the Tsar were displayed alongside religious icons of the Virgin Mary or Jesus, reflecting the belief that his authority was both political and divinely ordained. Nicholas II became Tsar in 1894 and would be the last ruler of the Romanov dynasty. Deeply religious and firmly committed to the principle of absolute monarchy, he believed that God had chosen him to rule Russia and that his authority should not be limited by representative institutions or constitutional reforms. Although many contemporaries described him as personally kind, devoted to his family, and well-intentioned, he was also widely regarded as politically weak, unimaginative, and indecisive. Members of the Russian court often expressed concern about his suitability for the throne and his lack of preparation for leadership. One advisor famously remarked that Nicholas's father, Alexander III, died either too early or too late. Too late because Nicholas had already reached adulthood and inherited power, yet too early because he had not received the training, experience, and discipline necessary to govern a vast and complex empire effectively. Nicholas's German-born wife, Alexandra, exerted enormous influence over both her husband and the Russian government. Strong-willed and deeply convinced of the divine right of the monarchy, she frequently involved herself in political affairs despite having little political experience or skill. Nicholas relied heavily on her advice, often accepting her judgments without question, even when they alienated government officials and undermined public confidence in the regime. Her influence became especially controversial during times of crisis, contributing to instability within the government and increasing distrust of the imperial family. As a result, Russia entered the 20th century under a ruler who remained firmly committed to autocracy but lacked the leadership, decisiveness, and political ability necessary to govern an increasingly troubled empire. In 1904, Russia and Japan went to war over competing ambitions in East Asia, particularly in Manchuria and Korea. The conflict began when Japan launched a surprise attack against Russia's Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur, catching the Russian government and military completely unprepared. Throughout the war, Russia suffered a series of humiliating defeats on land and at sea, ultimately losing much of its Pacific naval power. The government continued to pour enormous resources into what increasingly appeared to be a hopeless conflict, while economic hardships at home intensified and many ordinary Russians struggled to obtain adequate food and basic necessities. The war shattered the image of Russia as an invincible great power. Many Russians had assumed their nation was destined to dominate Asia and defeat at the hands of Japan, an outcome that surprised many Europeans who viewed Japan through racist and dismissive stereotypes, dealt a severe blow to national pride. As military failures mounted, public unrest grew, revolutionary movements gained support, and confidence in Nicholas and his government steadily eroded. By the early 20th century, Pressure for change was mounting across Russian society. Liberals called for a constitutional government that would limit the power of the Tsar, while industrial workers organized strikes to protest poor wages and working conditions. Peasants, who made up the majority of the population, demanded access to more land, and ethnic and religious minorities pressed for greater rights and recognition. At the same time, political violence became more common as revolutionary organizations challenged the government, and radical ideas spread rapidly among workers, students, and intellectuals. Russia's humiliating defeats in the Russo-Japanese War intensified each of these grievances, exposing the weaknesses of the regime and undermining public confidence in the Tsar. By 1905, the Russian Empire was becoming increasingly unstable and faced growing demands for fundamental political and social reform. On January 9, 1905, thousands of workers and peasants marched peacefully to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to present a petition to the Tsar. Far from seeking revolution, many of the demonstrators still deeply revered the Tsar and believed that he was unaware of the hardships they faced. They hoped that if they could personally appeal to their little father, he would address their grievances and improve their conditions. The marchers carried religious icons and portraits of the Tsar as symbols of their loyalty, and they came unarmed, intending to petition rather than protest. However, Nicholas was not in the city that day, and the troops assigned to guard the palace became alarmed as the crowds approached. Soldiers opened fire on the demonstrators, killing and wounding men, women, and children. The violence sparked panic throughout the city, and reports of the massacre quickly spread across the empire. Known as Bloody Sunday, the event shattered the long-standing image of the Tsar as the benevolent protector of the Russian people. Many Russians concluded that if the Tsar permitted such violence against loyal subjects, he could no longer be regarded as their father, but instead had become their enemy. Although Nicholas ordered an investigation into the incident, it produced no meaningful reforms or accountability, further deepening public anger and distrust of the monarchy. After Bloody Sunday, Russia descended into widespread unrest and revolutionary turmoil. Across the empire, workers launched massive strikes that crippled factories, transportation networks, and urban economies. In the countryside, peasants rose up against landowners, seizing estates and demanding redistribution of land. Political violence also escalated as revolutionary groups carried out assassinations against government officials and prominent members of the ruling elite, including one of the Tsar's own uncles, Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich. Even the armed forces, traditionally a pillar of the autocratic regime, showed signs of rebellion. Mutinies erupted within the military and navy, most famously aboard the battleship Potemkin, where sailors revolted against their officers. These uprisings revealed the depth of dissatisfaction within Russian society and demonstrated that opposition to the Tsarist government extended far beyond a small group of revolutionaries. By 1905, Russia faced a full-scale political crisis that threatened the stability of the entire imperial system. Under enormous pressure from mounting unrest, Nicholas issued the October Manifesto on October 30, 1905. The document promised significant political reforms, including the creation of a new legislative assembly known as the Duma, limited constitutional government, expanded civil liberties, and greater opportunities for political participation. For the first time in Russian history, an elected body would have the authority to pass laws rather than merely advise the monarch. Many Russians viewed the manifesto as a major victory and a potential turning point in the struggle for political reform. However, while Nicholas publicly accepted these concessions, he never embraced them in principle. He continued to believe firmly in absolute monarchy and often sought ways to limit the Duma's influence and preserve his own authority. As a result, Russia's first step toward constitutional government remained incomplete, and tensions between the Tsar and advocates of reform persisted.